Hello and welcome to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyun Park from Amalgam Insights, joined by Charlie Araujo. Charlie, how are you today?
Oh, I am great. Still a little sick, but almost through it, and looking forward to a great conversation. It's a really dead week. I mean, there was like no big news at all, right?
I know nothing broke, right? Nothing happened.
I wonder what we're going to talk about.
Nobody got stranded in airports. Nobody had trouble buying anything. Things. Yeah, obviously, Crowdstrike
Yeah,
happened. Yes.
I always know it's a big event when my father calls me up and says, "So tell me the inside scoop of what's going on." It's like, all right, when it's elevated to his level, it's a big story.
hmm Yes. So obviously, CrowdStrike, market leading security solution used to help track software and to help with updates and patching. Um, they messed up a little bit, as you may have heard. They struggled with the most recent Windows update and ended up blue screen of deathing many machines.
8.5 million of them, from what we hear now, right?
Yes, 8.5 million estimated. And if you are a customer of any sort, you probably noticed this sometime on Friday. If you work in the government, you probably noticed this because you suddenly had nothing to do all day long. Oh gosh. But obviously this was bad, but how bad was it really? Beyond the obvious.
So, I think it's actually the fair question that people are asking. I mean, this had one of those massive impacts, and interestingly enough, for recent times anyway. Well, two things. One is this was immediately preceded by a much smaller outage within the Azure stack. And so there was a little bit of confusion originally when all this was going down as to what was what. But this was a little bit unusual in that we haven't actually seen a widespread um, endpoint outage like this in a long time. Most of the outages we've had recently have been at the core when we talk about the major cloud providers and something happening within a big data center. And so, it also made it a lot harder to deal with because it was causing the fabled and notorious blue screen of death. And unfortunately, that also meant the systems were offline and couldn't be remotely managed and updated. So it was, of course, a logistical nightmare that manifested in the form of all these different ramifications for people that use these systems for point of engagement. And so it was obviously a big mess. Now, there are a few big takeaways from my standpoint. The first is there's a reason I'm a Mac user. Sorry, Microsoft, because there was no
Oh,
impact to Macs or to Linux environments, and that has a lot to do with the underlying architecture of the systems that made this particular issue possible. But the other thing is there is the latest news from Microsoft is that it's 8.5 million, which sounds like a lot, but that's one, according to Microsoft, only 1% of the systems out there that were actually impacted by this.
mhm.
So on that scale, it wasn't that big of a deal. I mean, obviously it was because of the ramifications, but it just shows you, how widespread something can, the widespread impact, even something relatively small. Now, the big takeaway, I think, for me is that what it really pointed to more than anything else, we can dissect, and I haven't seen any really good sort of postmortems out from CrowdStrike yet to really understand the intimate details of what has happened. I mean, a little bit is out there, but I think to a certain extent, it might not even matter because the what I think it's really pointing to is just how complex our environments are now, and how difficult, therefore, any testing is. I'm part of a group and a service management group, and it's like some people were saying, so like they clearly didn't test this, and I wrote back, it's like they clearly had to have tested this. I have no doubt they tested, right? It just we are not at a point where a company like CrowdStrike, I mean, they're not a little shabby tech company. The issue isn't that they're not testing, it's that something got missed or there was something that was unanticipated, and so much of that has to do with the underlying complexity in our tech stack that we're going to see more of this. We're going to see a lot more of this because it is getting incredibly difficult to manage against this. And I know there's some folks out there saying, well, this is about dependency issues, that we have too much consolidated. I think there's some validity to that, but I think there's also just this recognition that we're going to have to take some new ways of approaching things because of the level of complexity.
Yeah, I wonder about the testing part there because it seems like some sort of test that actually did this worked with the newest version of Windows and looked at this in production should have been able to replicate this blue screen of death before this launch. So I'm wondering what kinds of tests or what kinds of synthetic activity might be happening from a testing perspective to at before they go live. Uh, it's hard for me to think that they're not cutting corners in some way. CrowdStrike actually had a similar problem with Debian Linux about 3 months ago, where they were creating basically fatal errors because they had not fully tested the latest version of Debian Linux. So it's not that this hasn't happened before. And honestly, this isn't a CrowdStrike only problem. There are documented issues with many other security and patch management companies that have done this. Keeping up with the latest and greatest is really hard to do, especially because of the intricacies of each update that happens. I,
Well, I also think it, you mentioned that the I think one of the critical factors of this is a security issue, right? And this wasn't a security breach. There's no indication that it was like a hack or an attack, but because it's security, that's why CrowdStrike required such deep access into the OS. And the hard part is, so one of the questions, like again, and I saw it frankly as naive, and maybe I'm being harsh, but it's like, well, why would CIOs let this just auto update? Well, it's because the risks of having a vulnerable security plane are so high that you give trusted access to these systems so that they can keep themselves up to date. So there's not a gap in coverage, and that's really what opened this door to it. And I know that for some people, the responses will close that, but I'm not sure that I would do that. I think, the big, before we got on camera, we were asking like, well, what's the big takeaway for a CIO? I don't know that I have one. I mean, it's like you're kind of screwed. It's like this is a very difficult spot to be in, and all it really does is expose your vulnerability to these outside forces that you have very, very little control over. Because I don't think the answer is to lock this down and say that you're not going to let, whether it's CrowdStrike or anybody else, have access for those sort of auto updates. I don't think that this was that I would have said the onus should have been on the CIO or the IT organization to test this more properly. I mean, it's like they're really kind of in a difficult spot with this.
yeah, because the actual answer would theoretically be to choose a lot of best in breed apps that you have thoroughly vetted and have full access to so that you can make sure at all times that every single version and every single patch meets all of your standards and that you are technically evaluating all of these software solutions constantly. This is not something that IT can practically do in a world where an enterprise has thousands of apps that are being used. It's the entire reason that we use companies like Microsoft or like Amazon in the first place. We need somebody that can handle some level of complexity for all the things we're trying to do in our business across productivity and email and CRM and customer relationships, supply chain, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We cannot handle the complexity of having one app for each purpose, times it would probably be like times 5,000 if we really got to that level of granular control and scale that you would need to do to handle all this manually.
Yeah, no question about it. I think that there's another couple of little subtle lessons that people aren't talking about, right? So obviously, CrowdStrike took a hit. Microsoft, I think, rightfully is bearing. I mean, I feel a little bad for Microsoft, but I think part of what opened the door is their fundamental architecture, and that is so. I think they should bear some of the responsibility for this. But what is interesting is with a couple of little exceptions, for the most part, all the organizations that have been impacted by this, they're not taking the hit, right? And the lesson as the CIO is you want to put yourself in a position where you're sort of not left holding the bag, and that's what's happened here. And the related answer is what you really need to be prepared for is your response to something, because there will be more situations like this that you can't control they're outside of your controls, right? So I'm not talking about things where you and your team are making the changes, and if you blow that up, that's on you. But when it's happening outside of your control, then the real question is, how do you respond? And so it's been really interesting to see, like, Delta's coming under fire, Delta, the airline company, coming under fire, not because they had the outage, everyone had the outage. It's because they have had a really poor response to it, which is unusual for a Delta in my experience. But nevertheless, that being prepared to deal with these sort of circumstances, I think is really the area that if you're a CIO that you need to be focusing on. How do we, right, assume that you're going to have the sort of event, and how are you going to respond to it, and what do you do in those circumstances? And I think that's where you're going to see the winners and losers sort of shake out on this.
Yes, and as we spoke about with Snowflake in the past, they've had some notable data breaches associated with their platform recently, and it's the same thing. Whose fault was it? It was a number of people's faults, but the real question was, what were you able to do as Ticketmaster or AT&T after these breaches occurred, and what are you doing to make sure they don't happen again? And how much responsibility are you willing to take as the end user that actually chose the solution in the first place and theoretically did your due diligence? As much as we don't want vendors to mess up, we do select vendors. We buy selections. We buy and select these technologies. That nobody, with very few exceptions, put a gun to our head and said, "You have to buy this."
Wait, what are the exceptions? Did someone once put a gun to your head and say you had to buy something?
Have you ever negotiated with Oracle? I mean, they're
Oh,
really
oh,
tough. No, no, no.
it's interesting though. I think so. I want to talk. I want to ask your opinion on the one part of this that to me has left me sort of scratching my head. So you talk about that, and then let's while most of the world had not heard of CrowdStrike before this, CrowdStrike is not a small company. They are. I think they would have been considered a pretty safe bet, right? So I
Yes.
think when you're talking about someone doing their due diligence, this is not organization where someone's going, oh, they really went on a limb here. So I think it is a challenge because this should have been a good investment to make if you're, say, a CIO that went down this road. And which is why I think most of them were safe, because they obviously, if you look at who was affected, they were certainly not alone, and it was some of the most high profile companies in the world that were impacted, all of that. But one of the subplots that sort of came out of this over this weekend was this idea of, well, the real underlying root cause is that we have too few companies dominating the landscape, the Microsofts, the Googles, the Amazons of the world, and that therefore that's what allows something like this to happen. And I'm sort of torn on the point because I don't know if having this highly disparate world. I mean, clearly, if every one of those companies ran on magically, with Microsoft had 50 competitors and everyone ran on a different platform, clearly this, well, maybe not clearly, but it would have been less likely to happen.
Mhm.
But I'm not sure that the trade-offs of that, because I mean, I think we all came from that world before this age of dominance, and it was a nightmare trying to manage everything. So I'm curious your take on this. I mean, do you think that's a real issue? Is this pointing to a problem with this sort of over dominance of a handful of companies?
I I don't think so yet. I understand that the Federal Trade Commission would probably disagree with me. They've been pretty aggressive about trying to find things that look like monopolies, but I think the bigger problem right now is the challenge of maintaining what we're calling day zero or day one support associated with updates that are happening more frequently and with less scheduled notice. This agile is fantastic from a creativity perspective and in creating new functions and capabilities that we're looking for from a future facing perspective. But it is hard to manage and it's hard to schedule for. At some point, IT benefits from having some sort of schedule, whether it's a weekly or monthly release, and simply saying that you released 28 times in a month. I know that sounds great from the vendor perspective, but from the end user perspective, I've always found that difficult because you are never quite sure what 1.0.1.0.1.0.1 is different from 1.0.1.1.0. That's what it feels like from the end user perspective in trying to figure out what you've got and what you're trying to support, quite frankly. So I think that part is quite challenging. There has to be some sort of rationalization, I feel like, of how to deal with uh, day one support and agile software development at some point, at times thousands of apps.
I mean, I think it's tough. I think if I look at this and I try to weigh this in the balance, and I it's not like a Pollyanna. I've worked with, you mentioned Oracle, a lot of these big companies, and inside of them, they're not nearly as cohesive as we would like. At some of the things that, as analysts, we often criticize them for, that they're sort of Frankensteining things together. But nonetheless, I have a better chance of a Microsoft figuring out how to make all of their pieces that they're delivering into the market work together than trusting that they and 70 other companies are going to somehow figure out how to play nicely in the sandbox. And so I look at this and go, well, I get the dominance, and leaving the monopoly FTC stuff aside for a moment, right? I mean, from a purely technical perspective, I look at this and if I'm a CIO today, this weekend notwithstanding, I'm still leaning into going more towards the enterprise suite posture of looking for companies and partners that are bringing together a whole host of the solution, because I'm trying to reduce my footprint. I'm trying to reduce the number of things that I have to manage and handing that off. And I know this weekend wasn't a great, case study in what happens when you hand that off. But again, I'll go back to my point. Those CIOs, for the most part, are not holding the bag right now, right? They handed it off and they sort of got a little bit of absolution for that, because we are entrusting these big companies to get it right. And when they don't, there are big ramifications, and we're going to have news stories. But the reality is, the reason it's the news story is that most of the time they do get it right. Most of the time they execute, and it works, frankly, better than the average IT organization can do this on their own, particularly across, like you said, this massive landscape of infrastructure and applications. And so, I read those. I thought they were interesting, but I'm not sure I'm buying the story.
Yeah, my biggest concern is that if people do say the worst case scenario, they wholesale move away from CrowdStrike, they move to a variety of other solutions. I feel like to some extent that could potentially exacerbate the problem. So as IT and technology professionals love to just create more standards and use more solutions, and it adds to the permutations and complexity that Microsoft has to think about with its ecosystem at the end of the day. We want some level of standardization, frankly, when we're thinking about our biggest vendors, so that we know what we're dealing with. And creating more fragmentation does not standardize by definition.
Yeah, so I'm going to get us way off topic. In fact, we should move on. But that's partly why I get pretty angsty about the EU, and some, like, I look at what they're doing with Apple and trying to break down the walled garden, and I get the anti-competitiveness aspects. But one of the things I've always loved about Apple, that walled garden was protective. It helped ensure that everything was in fact controlled.
Mhm.
But anyway, speaking of monopolies, there's a whole nother the growing monopolies on the AI side with OpenAI and Anthropic and the handful of the next generation of big tech companies. And there's been some interesting movement about something that we've been talking about for a long time, because of course we're very, very smart and see everything happening before it happens. But we've been talking a lot about the small language model and the mid-sized language models, and why, from an operationalization and from an enterprise perspective, they may actually be more relevant. And there's some news this week, actually a whole bunch of little news pieces that are all sort of pointing in that direction. So I don't know if you want to go down that road.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see that on the one hand, you see the likes of Elon Musk and Meta working on these hundreds of billions of parameter model, large language models. And those are going to be obviously complex and probably provide great results, to be quite honest. But they're also going to be extremely compute intensive. So it looks like there's a lot of effort right now to create smaller models that can be practically deployed in enterprise projects. And we're seeing that both with OpenAI announcing their GPT 4o mini, which is an 8 billion parameter model. And we're also seeing Mistral come out with its Mistral Nemo, which is a 12 billion parameter model, both with 128K context length windows and basically providing very high level answers, very with similar performance, not quite as good as their parent models might be, but on par with what people have been seeing from a generative AI perspective.
Yeah, what I think was interesting. So I'll keep the two other ones that one that you brought up and one that I did, and that is a announcement by Vectara that they've raised $25 million for a purpose-built Mockingbird, with a purpose-built LLM called Mockingbird, specifically for enterprise RAG applications, and then a Wall Street Journal article that was talking about the fact that these enterprises are in fact starting to focus on these smaller and mid-sized language models. And what was interesting about both of these stories, and the reason I'm bringing up in this context, is to sort of juxtapose them to the OpenAI and the Mistral. So OpenAI and Mistral, they are smaller. I don't know, I guess we'd call these mid-sized language models, smaller language models. And they're really, the only purpose is to reduce cost. And maybe, I guess speed, but I think like the big ones are still outperforming them from a speed perspective. So it's really about reducing the resource load. And the challenge I have with that is it's like I struggle with, well, when do I use which? Like I use this tool called Raycast, and I have access to like 14 different models across this entire spectrum. And I really struggle about like, when do I switch? When do I use one versus the other? Because there's so little differentiation, at least that's exposed. And again, you and I, we spend a lot of time doing this. I can't imagine someone who doesn't interact with this, like having any clue what to do with it. And so, in fairness, the 4.0 mini is, at least if I'm understanding, it's accessible only by API. So they're obviously catering this to developers to say this is a cheaper way to get access to some of these use cases. But I brought up these other two stories because where I actually think this is going to end up is the way those stories are indicating. And these are companies that are building purpose-built smaller LLMs to solve a specific use case. And so one of the quotes in the Wall Street Journal article was, I don't necessarily need to understand, who Shakespeare is and all the sonnets and be able to do that if I'm trying to solve for the specific use case. So let's define the use case and train the model to that point. And that's a lot of what we heard from the Snowflake and the Databricks idea of you're building custom LLMs. And so I look at that and I think that's the better approach. So I'm a little iffy is maybe not the right word, but it just like I don't, simply making a smaller parameter model, which is what OpenAI and Mistral are doing, by themselves, I don't think is necessarily the best approach. I think it's this nuanced, targeted application, which I think is going to deliver better results.
Yeah, I'm excited about what's happening with generative AI models right now because it seems like there's a lot of opportunities to make things more efficient and to figure out how to get the same results with a tenth of the effort. So, and there's multiple areas where we could get an 80 to 90% improvements. And this is one of them, looking at, say, an 8 billion parameter model instead of a 100 billion parameter model, and the compute efficiencies you get along with that. Perhaps that also means we can actually improve the efficiency of our storage and compute as we start figuring out which aspects of the processing actually affect the chips and the storage involved. We might be able to affect the models themselves from a mathematical perspective, as we've covered before, as UC Santa Cruz is working on from an academic perspective. So all these pieces are coming together to start transforming these models from something that seems to require a glass of water to cool down the computer every time you do a query to something where a prompt starts becoming much more like a standard request from a computing perspective.
Yeah, I also think So I think we're going to have this very nuanced sort of, or what we're seeing develop is this much more nuanced view of this, right? Because I also think, and like I know I mentioned I use a system, and I have different. Well, one of the ways I tune my models is I use the Llama model, which is what comes to be a Perplexity, which is tuned for search.
Mhm.
um, when I'm doing things where it's like I'm looking for information and I want to be able to understand the sources so I can validate this on my own, versus I tend to use either Open ChatGPT 4.0 or Anthropic Cloud 3.5 when I'm looking for brainstorming and I'm trying to kind of go more creatively. And what I think is interesting is the Mockingbird LLM. The focus here is RAG, and where I'm a little bit concerned is not the right word, but where I want to understand more is that they are calling this grounded search, and I think that we're gonna, we've talked a lot about this in the past, is that in the end what we're going to find is that LLMs and generative AI is not the end all be all.
Yes.
And the big question is this whole approach that they're taking even going to be the right one in the end? Because it's like when I use AI for search, I'm very circumspect. I'm very careful about, depending on what I'm looking for, how I'm digging into that. And the whole point of this approach that they're taking is to try to reduce the level of hallucination and to try to make it more reliable for enterprise search. But I put my CIO hat on. It's like, I don't know if I'm going to go there at all. It just really concerns me, um, because you know, like I said, I use it every day, but I've had to give me just some bizarre answers, you know. So I need the ability to go check it, and so I'm really kind of curious as to how these use cases are developing, and I think that's going to be the real battles, as this plays out, is where these use cases sort of get placed and how people are applying them.
Right. So all these standalone models that are being created by the likes of Mistral and OpenAI, of course, when we are using them from an enterprise use case, we are probably going to be doing some level of fine tuning or retrieval augmented generation. And this startup called Vectara, started by former Cloudera CTO Araujo, they've been working on this, what they call grounded search. It's a version of retrieval augmented generation. They've been doing their flavor of it for a couple of years. And it's interesting how they are trying to work on making this more fine tuned, so that it focuses on facts and can't be pulled off of the facts as easily as some generative AI models can be. We've all probably, if you've played with generative AI, you know that you can start fudging the answer if you start bullying the model or giving assumptions that may not have any actual factual grounding to them. The model will just accept what you're saying if it doesn't have anything to push back against. And that's part of what Vectara is trying to work on with their specific Mockingbird LLM. And they're trying to provide some help so that you can see explanations associated with answers and that you can be protected against prompt attacks. So if you're in the middle of a discussion, you can't accidentally get some prompt slipped in from a third party that suddenly messes up everything that you're doing. That those are the types of problems that they're working on, and I think at least that's the right direction to be going from a generative AI perspective. That we need to be thinking about the security issues associated with AI, just like we've been dealing with data security issues so much in the recent weeks. Um, Whether this is the right way to go, or whether there are better upstream or downstream solutions for AI, that's still very much a question that requires answers. Honestly, I keep saying this over and over again, but I still think of this as such early days for generative AI, just because we have been on the hype cycle for this for almost 2 years doesn't mean that we've figured out all the answers or that all of this is 100% enterprise ready.
Yeah, and I'm probably being too hard on it because the reality is we don't have anything else right now. But I will say that and maybe it is. I'm always just wary of the hype and of the big proclamations. Um, but I'm a believer of RAG. I'm a believer of this idea of you know opening it up so that we don't have this in a black box, so we can see what's going on and understanding what's happening. And I do think we have some amazing use cases. I guess the way I look at this is it's really about, and maybe the big message in all of these stories for me is focus on the use case, focus on the problem you're trying to solve, and then see if you can get enough confidence in the ability of whatever LLM or whatever technology you're using to drive it. And the one thing I wish that I would continue to see more of, and maybe this is what kind of triggered me a little bit, is as we've said a thousand times so far on here, right? Generative AI is not the only form of AI. We were preceded by many other forms of machine learning predictive models that I think one of the best ways to stop hallucinations is to merge these together, is to bring in these other elements that are not solely reliant on the generative pieces. And I think that will go a long way, which is part of what RAG is, right? Part of what RAG is trying to do. But I think that's the big takeaway, as we've talked about before, of not getting swept up in all of it. And speaking of getting swept up, I want to finish on what I think. Unless there's something else you want to cover, but my favorite news piece for the week about the sort of hilarious thing from a company called Lattice. I don't know if you saw it, but basically this company Lattice, which is an HR company, and that's what makes this, I think, hilarious, is that they announced that they were going to, in their HR system, start allowing for AI bots to be effectively created as first class citizens, where they would actually have official employee records, and they can be onboarded and trained and assigned goals and treated just like a human. And there's two parts of the story. The first is the unsurprising backlash. I mean, I have to remember the time, but it was like days, where it's just like people just lit it up, and it's like, what the hell are you doing? And they backtracked as fast as you can imagine. But more than, I mean, what I almost find more fascinating beyond the backlash is like, why? What were they thinking? I don't for the life of me understand why you would even want to do that. But I don't know, maybe I missed something. So I don't know what your your take on that whole story.
So we've looked at AI workers. We talked about Cognition AI's Devin a few weeks ago, and we know that there are bots that are going to be doing human tasks, but giving them actual HR definition seems a little weird. I think part of this goes back to the phrase human resources in the first place. I've never loved that phrase because I don't consider myself to be a resource as much as I agree with the human part, not so much the resource part, because we know what we do with our resources. Let me just put it that way. So I I think that this goes a little too far in trying to resource the skill rather than understand what a human needs to be successful within a workplace. And I think that's an important lesson. And although Lattice went too far in calling their AIs something that needs to be recorded in HR, I do think there's a little bit of truth in here for companies to be cautious of whether they are actually treating their employees as people or treating them as cogs, and
The
creating the
other side.
reporting records to match whether they are actually humans or not.
Well, funny you say that. So I think there's a few sides of this. I mean, I think in part it's the fault of people like, I forgot the name of the company that released Devon, but that company and that announcements, and Automation Anywhere has been beating this drum for years now about hiring the workers 5/9. I don't know if they still do this, but for a while their pricing was you were buying their AI agents, literally paying on a per agent basis, much like you would hire an employee. So there's a lot of companies have been trying to go down this road, and I think it's a fool's errand to try to treat a technology like this the same way you would treat an employee. from any dimension, whether that's how I manage them, how I pay them, how I, any of that. At the end of the day, let's not lose sight of the fact that at least until we get an iRobot type robot that's going to literally act and behave like a human, this is just technology. It's fancy technology with fancy names, and it, I have full on conversations with my AI assistants. I understand that it can feel that way sometimes, but it's still just a piece of technology. I have an off button, I turn it off, and I go about my life. And I think that any organization, to your point, that fails to recognize the inherent and unique value that a human brings to the equation and attempts to normalize that or make it, equivalencies, they're asking for trouble across every dimension. Not only like getting this backlash, but that, to your point, that really means they are failing to look at their people in the proper light that's going to generate the most benefit for both them and their employees. So I think there's just so much. I mean, I just sort of laughed when I read this article because it was like there is so much wrong about it. And it speaks to, I think, the challenges that we're going to continue to have in this space as people try to kind of find the way forward.
Yeah, and I think the flip side of that is also I worry that companies are overestimating the proactiveness that AI can have towards tasks and learning. The AI, as we have it right now, is not proactive. It responds to what you're doing with the mediocre or average response that it gets from the world, the internet, which is fine. It's actually works pretty well for a whole bunch of things, but let's not mistake that for what a human does at the end of the day.
Yeah, no doubt. I use another one of the AIs I use is called Pi by, I forgot the company that got gutted by Microsoft, but and it introduced this proactive feature because it's, predominantly lives on your phone, and so it has access to notification. And so it asked me one day if I wanted it to like proactively engage with me. I said I thought that was great, and now it just bugs the crap out of me. It's like gives me stupid. It's not at all. It's giving me generic, like you said, mediocre, generic, blah blah blahs that do absolutely nothing to add any value to my life. And so I think that may change. We've talked a lot about agents. I think that will change. I think when Apple rolls out an Apple Intelligence where it actually has contextual awareness of everything going on, that may start opening the door to this being more proactive. But even then, it's still not going to be human-like. We are so far from that, so far. And so I think, the big lesson, if you're a CIO or if you're an enterprise executive and looking at this, is just don't do it. If anything, you need to be looking at this as all of this as a tool to make your human employees that much more powerful in what they're doing and productive, and let them have more enjoyment with their work, and let these bots, let the technology be technology, and don't try to mix the two together like that.
Charlie, thank you so much for pushing off the onset of Skynet, maybe another month with your warnings.
At least a couple.
Yeah. And on that note, I think we'll call it a week. So we only covered a few things this week, but they were big ones. And let's hope for not too many more surprises like CrowdStrike throughout the rest of the summer.
Yeah,
Thanks a lot for
exactly.
joining. Yeah. Thanks a lot for joining. And if you're checking us out online, just make sure to like, subscribe, comment, and let us know what you think. Thanks a lot for joining us.